Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today, we are going to be talking about wisdom.
Ooh, that's a big one.
It is a big one. And, we had one of our listeners send us this really cool model called the Wisdom Onion model. And it's got some pretty fascinating ideas about how we should think about wisdom.
I love that. The wisdom onion model. That's a great visual.
It is. So, we often think of wisdom as like this destination.
Right.
You reach the top of the mountain, you're wise. But this model kind of presents it as something that unfolds in layers. So we are going to kind of peel back these layers today and maybe, just maybe, shed a few tears along the way as we encounter some of that onion sting.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. Like each layer kind of reveals something deeper and maybe a little bit more pungent than the last. I like that.
Yeah, and we'll see what kind of nourishment it offers as well. So we'll be diving into the Wisdom Onion model today. Should we just jump right in?
Yeah, let's peel back that first layer.
Okay, so the first layer is called thoughtful action. And it's basically, this is that outermost layer, the most visible part of wisdom. How we actually behave in the world, how we think and speak and act, in the moment. And I thought it was really interesting how it talked about the integration of logic and emotion. It's not just about being, all head or all heart. It's about this blend.
Yeah, and I think what's really important about that idea is that it's not saying that one is better than the other,
Yeah.
right? Like we need both of those things. It's the interplay of logic and emotion.
Right.
So logic brings that clarity, that ability to analyze, see the components, maybe the structure of a situation.
Yeah.
But what the model really points to is how over-reliance on logic, without considering the emotional element, can actually be a barrier to wise action.
Hmm.
Especially, I think, in situations where human relationships are involved. You can come up with solutions that look good on paper but lack empathy and ultimately fail because they haven't accounted for the emotional complexity of the situation. Emotion, on the other hand, brings in that crucial element of understanding, of intuitive grasp, of the needs and feelings of others that we might not necessarily be able to put into words or into, a spreadsheet. So wisdom in this first layer is really about that ongoing conversation.
Yeah.
That conversation between our rational mind and our emotional intelligence, that guides how we respond in a given moment.
And that conversation then leads right into communication, right? Because it's not just about us having the thoughts and the logic and the emotions, but it's about how we express that. And a lot of times this document emphasizes the importance of listening more than speaking.
Right, and really being intentional with our words.
Yes.
And really asking ourselves, are our words going to uplift or are they just going to kind of prove a point? So I think there's this fascinating point here about communication is not just about broadcasting our own views, right? It's about understanding. So there's real power, real wisdom in prioritizing listening, in actively seeking to understand the other person's perspective before we even formulate a response.
Yeah.
And then when we do choose to speak, to really examine our intention.
Right.
Like, are we aiming to contribute something meaningful, to offer support, to maybe guide someone in a positive direction? Or are we just trying to kind of assert ourselves and win argument, And it even suggests that sometimes the wisest action is to actually choose silence,
Yes.
to just not engage in the heat of the moment, because
Yeah.
we know that whatever we say is either going to be unproductive or hurtful.
Right. Or we'll regret it later.
Right.
And then there's this whole dance between action and patience, which is something that I'm always like struggling with. When do I jump in? When do I kind of wait?
It is a constant navigation, isn't it? Figuring out when is the right moment for action, when is the right moment for patience. I think the model suggests that wise action often comes from a place of clarity. So, when you've had time to process a situation, to understand all of the different facets, maybe you've let your emotions settle a little bit. And then you can act from a place of clearer understanding. Whereas when emotions are high, when that reactivity is kind of front and center, that's where patience becomes, I think, the wiser approach. And, I think it makes you think about how often do we act out of that immediate emotion rather than considered thought.
Yes.
And, that's where I think a lot of us get into trouble sometimes.
Or
We
just
just react impulsively rather than pausing, breathing, and choosing how to respond.
Yeah, and I think that ties right back into what we were talking about listening,
Absolutely.
because often we'll listen, react,
Yes.
without really taking that time.
Right.
All right, so we peeled back that first layer, thoughtful action. Let's move into the second layer, which is discernment in relationship. And this is all about, how wisdom shows up in our interactions with others. which is, I think, where it gets really interesting, because it's one thing to have wise thoughts,
Right.
but to actually put them into practice in our relationships with other people, that's where the rubber meets the road.
It is. And I think one of the key distinctions that this layer makes is between judgment and discernment.
Mm-hmm.
And that really stood out to me. So judgment, the model presents it as often rooted in this desire to categorize, to label, to put things in boxes,
Right.
to kind of create this separation between ourselves and others, us versus them.
Right.
And I think that can be very divisive.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas discernment is portrayed as more of a nuanced ability to understand,
Okay.
to perceive the subtle differences and complexities in people and in situations without immediately jumping to that categorization of good or bad, right or wrong. And I think it really builds on that idea from the first layer of really listening deeply.
Yes.
Because when we listen deeply, we start to understand all of the nuances, and we don't have to put things into these neat little categories that, ultimately don't really serve us.
And that then impacts how we communicate, right?
Right.
Because it talks about, that principle that we should really only speak if it's going to contribute to growth or preserve someone's dignity. I mean, how often do we really filter our conversations that way?
Right. That's a high standard,
It is.
but I think it encourages us to be much more mindful
Yes.
in our interactions with others, to really consider the impact of our words, to ask ourselves, are they likely to foster understanding and connection?
Mm-hmm.
Or could they potentially be hurtful, damaging to someone's sense of self-worth?
Right.
And so this layer really challenges us to think beyond just simply expressing our own thoughts and opinions, and to really consider the ethical dimension of communication in our relationships,
Yeah.
which I think is something that's often overlooked.
And I love that it talks about this kind of fluid movement between the roles of student, teacher, and friend.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of times, we get stuck in those roles. Like, oh, I'm the teacher,
Right.
you're the student. But in reality, it's always this kind of back and forth, right? And it's interesting how it talks about, that a wise teacher never stops being a learner.
I love that. And that really speaks to the humility that I think is at the heart of wisdom.
Yes.
Because it's about recognizing that learning is a lifelong process and that insights can come from anywhere, from anyone.
Right.
It doesn't matter what their title is, what their background is. Everyone has something to teach us.
Right.
And I also love that description of a wise friend as someone who's both loyal, but also encourages your growth.
Yes.
And I think that's so important because true friendship isn't just about, comfort and agreement. It's also about gentle challenge.
Right.
It's about support for personal development.
Right. Mm-hmm. And then we get to this part about conflict because, let's be honest, conflict happens in relationships. And it talks about how we disagree is crucial.
Yeah.
And it emphasizes this need to find a way to restore connection rather than just trying to win,
Mm-hmm.
which is, I think, a very mature perspective that a lot of us, we're still working on.
Yeah, and I think what's really important about that is it's not about proving dominance.
Right.
It's not about being right at all costs.
Mm-hmm.
Wisdom in conflict is about approaching those disagreements with the aim of understanding the other person's perspective.
Yes.
And to see if there's any way that any rupture in the relationship can be repaired.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the principle of sharing truth rather than imposing it is really important here.
Yes.
It's respecting the other person's autonomy and creating space for a more collaborative resolution rather than a power struggle,
Mm-hmm.
which so often, conflict devolves into.
Right.
And so I think this layer really reframes conflict as an opportunity, as an opportunity for deeper understanding and connection if approached with wisdom.
Yeah, and then it brings it all back to that question, are you wise with others, not just with ideas, which
Yeah.
I think is so profound.
It's a great question, because it's one thing to be able to grasp these abstract principles
Right.
intellectually, but it's another thing entirely to actually embody those principles
Yes.
in our real life relationships.
Yes.
And so I think this layer serves as a pertinent reminder that wisdom isn't a solitary pursuit.
Mm-hmm.
It's fundamentally relational.
All right, let's move even deeper
Okay.
into the third layer of the onion, inner awareness.
Going inward.
Yes. So now we're shifting from the external world to our internal world,
Mm-hmm.
and it's asking, what are those inner signs
Right.
that wisdom is actually developing within
And
her?
that we're on the right track.
Right.
Yeah.
So what are those things?
Well, I think this layer delves into some of the more subtle internal markers of wisdom. And I think the model points to things like, an increasing sense of inner peace.
Hmm.
Even when things around you might be chaotic or uncertain,
Right.
it's that ability to kind of stay centered amidst the storm.
Mm-hmm.
And it also talks about, this capacity to hold seemingly contradictory ideas or truths without feeling this urgent need to immediately resolve them,
Right.
to just be comfortable with the fact that, life is full of paradox.
Yeah.
And that's okay. And perhaps most significantly, it points to a shift towards prioritizing personal growth over the need to control every outcome.
Right.
Because I think so often, we get caught up in wanting to control everything to make sure that everything goes according to plan.
Hmm.
But I think as we develop wisdom, we realize that, that's just not possible.
Right.
And it's actually more important to focus on our own internal growth,
Mm.
on our own evolution, than it is to try to micromanage every aspect of our external reality.
And I love that it makes the point that wisdom doesn't just happen with age. You don't just turn 60 and suddenly you're wise.
There's no magic birthday.
Right. It's like, how does wisdom actually become wise?
Yeah, that's a great question.
And it talks about reflection, right? It's that taking the time to look inward and process our experiences.
Exactly. It's not an automatic byproduct of accumulating years, as nice as that would be,
Right.
but it's something that is actively cultivated through introspection, by taking the time to process our experiences, both the positive ones and the difficult ones.
Right.
And I think the model suggests that both of those can contribute to our wisdom. Painful experiences, when we reflect on them, can teach us so much about ourselves, about life, about resilience.
Right.
And moments of mindful presence can also deepen our understanding.
Yeah.
Just being present in the moment, noticing what's happening within us and around us can be incredibly illuminating. So it's about extracting the lessons from our journey, not just passively going through it.
And there's also this really interesting observation that, as you grow in inner awareness, you might start to feel a bit isolated.
Mm-hmm.
If your inner understanding isn't quite lining up with the world around you, like you're kind of ahead of the curve.
Yeah, like you're seeing things that other people aren't seeing.
Uh-huh.
And that can be a very real challenge, I think, when your internal compass is guiding you in a direction that feels different from the mainstream or from the people around you. And that can sometimes lead to feelings of isolation or being misunderstood.
Right.
And so the model really emphasizes, I think, the importance of integrity in those moments.
Mm-hmm.
Staying true to your own deeply held understanding, even if you're not getting external validation.
Right.
Because true wisdom isn't about seeking applause.
Right.
It's anchored in that quiet inner knowing.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be enough.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love how it says wisdom is as much a feeling as it is a framework.
Mm.
It's not just a set of principles, but there's something deeper there.
Right. It's embodied wisdom.
Yes.
It's not just something we think about, it's something we feel.
Okay, so now let's get to, I think, the heart of the onion.
Ooh, getting to the good stuff.
We're getting to the good stuff. This is heart wisdom.
The juicy part.
This is the juicy part, and this feels like we're really getting to the emotional core of what wisdom really is.
We are. This layer really digs into that emotional bedrock of wisdom. And I think compassion and forgiveness are front and center here.
Right.
As essential elements of what it means to be wise.
And it talks about, going beyond those surface behaviors, like
Yeah.
see the pain beneath the cruelty.
Mm-hmm.
Recognizing that often when people act in hurtful ways, it's because they're in pain.
Right, they're hurting. And that doesn't excuse the behavior, but it allows us to, I think, cultivate a deeper sense of empathy and understanding,
Yes.
towards ourselves and others.
And the point about forgiveness, I think, is so crucial.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times we think forgiveness is about condoning, but it really makes this distinction. It's not about condoning harmful behavior. It's about freeing ourselves from the burden of carrying those past hurts.
Exactly. I think forgiveness, as the model presents it, is really, first and foremost, an act of self-liberation. It's about making a conscious choice to not let past grievances continue to define us, to weigh us down, to hold us back.
Right.
And that can be incredibly difficult, and it's not about, saying what happened was okay. It's about choosing to move forward. And I also love the connection it makes to setting boundaries, because I think, so often people think about forgiveness as just kind of letting people walk all over you.
Right.
But establishing healthy boundaries,
Yeah.
saying This is what I'm willing to tolerate. This is what I'm not willing to tolerate. That can actually be a profound act of self-compassion
Yes.
and therefore a wise action in protecting your own well-being.
And then we have humility, which is so often linked to wisdom, right? You know, it's hard to imagine one without the other.
Right.
And it talks about this idea of admitting when we're wrong
Mm-hmm.
and staying open to learning from anyone, you know, no matter where they come from or what their status is.
Absolutely. And I think humility creates that space for growth. It creates that fertile ground for learning, because when we're, so attached to being right
Right.
or maintaining a particular image, or, our egos get in the way,
Right.
we can't really learn. Our minds are closed off.
Right.
But humility, as the model so beautifully puts it, ego is too heavy to carry inward.
Yes.
It's a burden. And so humility is about kind of letting go of that burden
Mm-hmm.
and opening ourselves up to truth and new understanding,
Right.
wherever it may come from. And it doesn't mean we have to, think less of ourselves or diminish ourselves.
Right.
It's just about recognizing that we don't have all the answers.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And this whole layer is described as this tender space where wisdom is deeply felt.
Yeah, it's not just in our heads, it's in our hearts.
Right.
It's embodied. We're moving beyond that purely intellectual understanding and into a place where our emotional intelligence is really front and center. Our capacity for empathy, our ability to forgive, these are all core components of wisdom.
Okay, now we've reached the center of the onion.
Heart of the matter.
This is it, paradox and presence.
Mm.
And it sounds like we are at the very heart of what wisdom is all about.
Yeah, I think we've been on this journey inward, and, each layer has kind of peeled away something, revealed something a little deeper.
Yeah.
And now we're at the core, at the essence. And what's so interesting about this layer is it's not about having all the answers.
Right.
It's not about having everything figured out. It's not about being able to resolve every contradiction, because, life is messy.
Right.
It's complex. And wisdom, I think, at this level is about that capacity to hold seemingly opposing truths simultaneously.
Right.
To be able to be both brave and afraid, to be kind but also firm, and to be fully present in the moment,
Yes.
even with all of those inherent tensions that life throws our way.
And I love that it talks about living the questions rather than just, always searching for those definitive answers.
Yeah, because sometimes there aren't any,
Right.
and that can be really uncomfortable for a lot of people.
Right.
But I think the invitation here is to become comfortable with that ambiguity, with that not knowing,
Yes.
and to trust that the answers will reveal themselves in time if we stay present, if we stay curious, if we stay open.
Mm-hmm.
So wisdom at this level isn't about eliminating the tension or the paradox.
Right.
It's about cultivating the ability to navigate those complexities
Right.
with a sense of acceptance
Yeah.
and groundedness in the present moment.
And it also talks about, even though this is that inner core, it talks about wisdom in community.
Right.
Like it's not just about us as individuals.
It's not. And I think it really underscores the idea that our personal growth, our wisdom is deeply intertwined with the growth and well-being of others.
Mm-hmm.
And it talks about this really important concept of holding space
Mm-hmm.
for others, which, simply means being fully present with someone, accepting their experience without judgment, without the need to fix it, without the need to offer advice.
Right.
Just being a compassionate witness
Yeah.
to their experience,
Yeah.
and allowing space for their unique perspective and truth to unfold.
Right.
And that's, I think, such a powerful act of love and wisdom in our relationships.
And finally, it gets to this idea of legacy and gentle leadership, which is about influencing others, not through force, but through intention.
Right.
Letting your wisdom kind of have that ripple effect.
Yes, I think it speaks to the enduring impact of true wisdom. It's not about making grand pronouncements or wielding power over others.
Right.
It's about leading through the integrity of our actions, through the thoughtfulness of our words, the consistency of our character.
Yes.
And that's much more subtle, but I think often a far more profound form of influence that creates that lasting positive impact on the world.
So as we kind of come to the end of our exploration of this model, we've journeyed from those outward actions all the way to this inner core of presence and paradox.
Yeah,
It's not a destination, it's a process.
it is.
And it's this beautiful illustration, I think, of how interconnected all of these different layers are.
Mhm.
Our actions can cultivate our inner awareness.
Right.
Our relationships can serve as these powerful mirrors
Absolutely.
for growth. And ultimately, our journey through all of these layers can lead us to a more grounded, compassionate, and present way of being in the world.
I love that. That's a beautiful way to sum it up.
And it all comes back to that quote: wisdom is not something you have. It's something you practice over and over again with humility, grace, and love.
I love that. It's so simple, but so profound.
Yeah.
And it's a reminder that wisdom isn't a static possession.
Right.
It's not something we acquire and then we're done.
Well,
It's an active, ongoing commitment
right.
to learning, to reflecting, to engaging with ourselves, with others, with the world around us, with more intention, with more empathy, with more understanding.
So as you reflect on the wisdom onion model, and as you kind of go through your day to day, ask yourself, which layer are you living in right now?
Mhm.
And what truth is ready to be revealed just beneath the surface?
Great question.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
It's been a pleasure.
See you next time.
See ya.